The colonel dropped his coffee cup. It shattered on the tile floor of the VA hospital lobby, and he didn't even look down. He was staring at the coin in my hand, the small bronze disc I'd been carrying in my pocket since my grandfather's funeral. His lips moved slightly, like he was reading something no one else could see. Then he looked at me with an expression I will never forget. Not surprise, not curiosity, fear. "Who gave you that?" he asked. His voice was barely above a whisper. I told him it belonged to my grandfather. That he had passed away 3 weeks ago. That no one came. The colonel closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, something behind them had shifted. "What was his name?" he asked. "Henry Calloway," I said. And the man in front of me, a decorated officer who had probably faced things I couldn't imagine, sat down slowly in the nearest chair as if his legs had stopped working. My grandfather lived in a faded blue house at the end of a gravel road outside Lewisburg, Tennessee. The kind of road that didn't show up on GPS. The kind of house where the porch sagged on one side and the screen door never closed right. He had a vegetable garden he tended every morning, a black lab named Duke who followed him everywhere, and a rocking chair on the porch where he'd sit for hours watching the tree line like he was waiting for something that never came. To most people in town, he was just old Hank, the quiet one. The man who fixed lawnmowers for free and left bags of tomatoes on neighbors' porches without knocking. He went to church on Sundays but always sat in the back row and left before anyone could talk to him. He never raised his voice. He never complained. He never asked for anything. To my parents, he was less than that. My mother called him stubborn. My father called him a waste of potential. They talked about him the way people talk about weather they can't change, with a shrug and a sigh and a quick change of subject. He could have done something with his life, my mother used to say. He just didn't want to. My father was more blunt. The man had no ambition, spent his whole life hiding in that house like the world owed him something. They never visited. Not on holidays, not on his birthday, not when the doctors told him his lungs were giving out. They sent a card at Christmas sometimes. My brother called once a year, usually in January, like a chore he'd forgotten to finish in December. I was the only one who went. I'd been stationed at Camp Lejeune with the Marines when I started driving up to Tennessee on long weekends. It was a 5-hour trip each way, and I made it as often as I could. Grandpa never asked me to come. He never asked anyone for anything. But when I pulled into his driveway, he'd already be standing on the porch with 2 cups of black coffee, as if he'd known I was coming before I did. We didn't talk much during those visits. We'd sit on the porch and listen to the birds. He'd point out a hawk circling above the field and say something like, "He's patient. That's why he eats." Sometimes we'd walk the property line together, Duke trotting ahead, and he'd tell me about the soil, the seasons, the way the creek rose in March. Small things. Ordinary things. But every now and then, he'd go quiet in a different way. Not peaceful quiet. Heavy quiet. Like a man standing at the edge of something deep and deciding not to jump. I asked him once, when I was maybe 22, what he did in the war. He looked at me with those pale blue eyes and smiled the way people smile when they're choosing between the truth and something kinder. "I helped people," he said. "That's all." That was always his answer. "I helped people. That's all." He got sick in October. Lung disease, the doctors said, possibly connected to chemical exposure decades ago, though no one could confirm what chemicals or where. He refused to go to the hospital, said he'd rather die looking at his garden than staring at a ceiling. A neighbor, Mrs. Perkins, checked on him daily and called me when he stopped getting out of bed. I requested emergency leave the same night. When I arrived, the house smelled like coffee and old wood and something faintly medicinal. He was lying in his bed, thinner than I'd ever seen him, with Duke curled up at his feet. He opened his eyes when I sat down beside him. "You didn't have to come all this way," he said. "Yes, I did," I said. He reached over and squeezed my hand. His grip was still strong. "You always were the stubborn one," he whispered. Then he smiled, and for a second, he looked like the man who used to push me on the tire swing in his backyard when I was 6 years old. I called my parents that night. My mother listened quietly while I explained how bad it was. "Well," she said, "he's had a long life." I waited for her to say she was coming. She didn't. "Tell him we're thinking of him," she said. Then she asked me about the weather in Tennessee. My father didn't answer his phone. He texted back the next morning. "Keep us posted." Grandpa passed away 2 days later. It was early morning. just before sunrise. The room was still. Duke lifted his head, looked at me, and then put it back down. That was it. No last words. No dramatic moment. Just silence where a heartbeat used to be. I handled everything myself. The funeral home, the burial plot, the small service at the church. 7 people came. Mrs. Perkins, the pastor, a couple from down the road who said Grandpa had helped them rebuild their fence after a storm, an elderly man in a worn army jacket who stood in the back and said nothing, and me. My parents didn't come. My mother said they couldn't get flights on short notice. My father said funerals were for the living and Grandpa wouldn't have cared either way. My brother sent flowers. The card said, "Rest in peace, Grandpa. Kyle." No period of silence. No moment of reflection. Just a transaction, completed and forgotten. After the service, I went back to the house to sort through his things. Most of it was what you'd expect. Old flannel shirts, a Bible with a cracked spine, stacks of National Geographic magazines from the 80s, a toolbox so heavy I could barely lift it. But in the bedroom closet, tucked behind a row of winter coats, I found a metal lockbox bolted to the floor. It wasn't locked. The latch was stiff, but it opened. Inside were 3 things: a worn leather journal, small enough to fit in a shirt pocket, a black and white photograph of a group of young men in jungle fatigues standing in front of a helicopter. No names on the back, no date, no location, and a coin, bronze, slightly larger than a quarter, heavier than it should have been. On one side was an eagle clutching an anchor, on the other side was a symbol I didn't recognize, a series of interlocking lines that looked almost like a language. No text, no motto, just that strange, deliberate pattern. I turned it over in my hand for a long time. I remembered seeing it once before. When I was maybe 10, I'd been rummaging through Grandpa's dresser looking for batteries and found it wrapped in a handkerchief at the bottom of a drawer. When he caught me holding it, his face changed in a way I'd never seen before. Not angry, not scared, something else entirely. "Put that back, sweetheart," he said quietly. "That's not a toy." "What is it?" I'd asked. He took it from my hand gently, folded it back into the cloth, and placed it in the drawer. "It's a reminder," he said, "of people I can't talk about." I never asked again. Now, standing alone in his empty bedroom, I put the coin in my pocket. Not because I understood it, but because it was the one thing he'd protected more than anything else. The journal was harder to read. Not because the handwriting was bad. It was actually precise, almost military in its neatness. But because it wasn't a diary. It was a record. Dates, coordinates, coded abbreviations. Entries like 12 Mar 68 PZ Bravo 6 extracted 2 Kia en route cleaned, or 04 AUG 69 LZ denied rerouted south contact heavy all accounted. Page after page, spanning years. No emotions, no reflections, just operational data written by a man who understood that feelings had no place in what he was documenting. I didn't know what any of it meant, but I knew it wasn't nothing. When I got back to base, I started asking questions, carefully, not through official channels, just through people I trusted. A retired gunnery sergeant I'd trained under years ago had spent time around special operations communities. I described the coin to him over the phone. He went quiet for a long time. "Where did you see that?" he finally asked. "It was my grandfather's," I said. "He passed away." Another pause. "Hank Calloway?" I almost dropped the phone. "You knew him?" "I didn't know him," he said slowly. "But I've heard that name once. Only once. And the person who said it told me never to repeat it." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means your grandfather wasn't who your family thought he was," he replied. "And that coin isn't something you'll find in any museum." He told me to be careful. He told me not to post anything online. And he gave me a name, Colonel James Mercer, retired, now volunteering at a VA hospital in Knoxville. "If anyone can tell you what that coin means," he said, "it's him. But don't be surprised if he doesn't want to." I drove to Knoxville the following weekend. The VA hospital was a large, tired-looking building on the edge of town, the kind of place that always seemed understaffed and overcrowded. I found Colonel Mercer in the lobby, handing out coffee to veterans in wheelchairs. He was tall, mid-70s, with sharp eyes and the kind of posture that never fully leaves a military man. I introduced myself and told him I had something that belonged to my grandfather. When I placed the coin in his palm, That was when he dropped his coffee. We sat in a small office in the back of the hospital. No windows, no decorations, just a metal desk and 2 plastic chairs. He set the coin on the desk between us and stared at it like it was a living thing. "Your grandfather," he said carefully, "was part of a unit that conducted operations in Laos and Cambodia between 1967 and 1972. I waited. These operations were never officially authorized," he continued. "The personnel involved were selected specifically because they could disappear. No families asking questions. No paper trails, no public records." "Disappear how?" I asked. "Their service records were altered," he said, "reassigned on paper to units that never saw combat. Desk jobs, supply chains, anything that looked unremarkable." He paused. "Your grandfather's official file says he spent 3 years as a supply clerk at Fort Bragg." "He was never at Fort Bragg," I said. "No," the colonel replied. "He was crossing borders most people didn't even know we were operating in." My hands were trembling. "What did he do?" "He was a combat medic attached to a long-range reconnaissance team," he said. 6-man units, deep insertion, weeks behind enemy lines with no support, no extraction guarantee, no acknowledgement." "A medic," I repeated. "The most important person on the team," the colonel said. "They went in to gather intelligence, rescue captured personnel, and disrupt supply lines. Your grandfather kept them alive. Multiple tours, exposed to Agent Orange, napalm residue, conditions that would break most people." I thought about his lungs, about the doctors who couldn't explain what chemicals had damaged them. "That's what killed him," I said. The colonel nodded slowly. "Most likely, but you'll never find that in a VA claim, because officially, he was never there." I looked at the coin on the desk. "And this? It's called a blood coin," he said. "Not an official term. It was given to men who completed a certain number of operations with 0 compromise, 0 captured, 0 turned, 0 exposed. It meant the man holding it had maintained absolute operational security under conditions most people can't even conceive of." "How many exist?" I asked. "That I know of? Fewer than 40 were ever issued. Most were destroyed when the program was shut down." "Why did he keep his?" The colonel's voice softened. "Because some men need proof that what they lived through was real, even if no one else will ever see it." I thought of Grandpa sitting on his porch, watching the tree line, waiting for something that never came. Maybe he wasn't waiting. Maybe he was remembering. "My family thought he was a failure," I said. The words came out harder than I intended. The colonel looked at me steadily. "That is the price of this kind of service," he said. "You save lives no one knows about, and in return, you live a life no one understands." I drove home in silence that night. No radio, no phone calls, just the highway and the dark and the weight of everything I'd just learned. The coin sat in my jacket pocket, and I kept touching it, running my thumb over the interlocking lines on the back, as if they might eventually spell out something I could read. I opened the journal again that night under my desk lamp. The entries that had seemed like meaningless data now pulsed with a terrible clarity. Each Kia was a death witnessed and carried in silence for decades. And at the bottom of the last page, in slightly different ink, as if written years after everything else, was a single line. "If my girl finds this, tell her the garden was the only mission I chose for myself." My girl. That's what he called me, since I was small. I sat there for a long time. The next weekend, I drove to my parents' house. I didn't plan what I was going to say. I just brought the journal, the photograph, and the coin. My mother was in the kitchen when I arrived. She looked surprised to see me. "Everything okay?" she asked. "We need to talk about Grandpa," I said. She sighed. That familiar sigh, the one that meant she'd rather discuss anything else. "Honey, I know you were close to him, but dwelling on it isn't going to. He wasn't a supply clerk," I said. I placed the photograph on the kitchen counter. "He was a combat medic in a classified reconnaissance unit. He spent years behind enemy lines in Laos and Cambodia. He saved dozens of lives that the United States government has never acknowledged." My mother stared at the photograph. "Where did you get this?" "His house, hidden in a lockbox in his closet." My father walked in from the living room. "What's going on?" I showed him the coin. A retired colonel identified this. It's a marker given to operators who completed classified missions with zero compromise. Fewer than 40 were ever made. My father picked it up, turned it over. This could be anything, he said. You know how he was, always making things seem bigger than they were. A colonel confirmed it, I said. A man who served in the same theater of operations. He recognized Grandpa's name. People make mistakes, my father said. But his voice had lost its edge. I opened the journal and placed it on the table. These are operational logs, dates, coordinates, extraction records. This is documentation of missions that never officially happened. My mother sat down slowly. She picked up the journal and turned the pages one by one. He was exposed to Agent Orange, I said. That's what destroyed his lungs. But because his missions were classified, he never filed a VA claim. He couldn't. Filing would have meant admitting he was somewhere the government said he never went. My father leaned against the counter. He didn't speak. He spent the last 30 years of his life in a house with a leaking roof and a 20-year-old truck, I continued. Not because he had no ambition, because he had been ordered to be invisible, and he honored that order until the day he died. Alone. The word hung in the air. My mother's hand was trembling on the journal. She turned to the last page, the one with Grandpa's final note. She read it once. Then again. Then she pressed her hand over her mouth and her shoulders began to shake. I didn't know, she whispered. I thought he was just what? I asked. She couldn't finish the sentence. My father took the journal from her. He read the last line slowly. His jaw tightened. He set it down carefully, like it might break, and walked out of the room without a word. I found him 20 minutes later, sitting on the back porch with his head in his hands. I told him he had no ambition, he said quietly, to his face, more than once. I sat down beside him. He never argued, my father continued. He never defended himself. He just nodded and changed the subject. His voice cracked. I thought that meant I was right. It meant he couldn't tell you the truth, I said. He could have said something. Anything. No, I said. He couldn't. That was the whole point. We sat in silence for a long time. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. The evening air smelled like cut grass and coming rain. I didn't go to his funeral, my father said. My own father's funeral. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say that would make that weigh less. My brother Kyle drove down the next day. He sat at the kitchen table and read through the journal without speaking. When he finished, he closed it gently and stared at the wall. He asked me to help him fix the roof last spring, Kyle said. I told him to hire someone. I know, I said. The man survived Cambodia and I told him to hire a roofer. He laughed, but it wasn't really a laugh. It was the sound of something breaking. Over the following weeks, something changed in my family. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but the way seasons change, slow enough that you don't notice until one day everything looks different. My father called Colonel Mercer himself. They spoke for nearly 2 hours. When he hung up, he didn't tell me what was said. He just sat quietly for a while and then drove to Grandpa's old church alone. My mother started going through old family photos, the ones she'd shoved into boxes in the attic years ago. She found pictures of Grandpa she'd forgotten existed. Him holding me as a baby. Him standing in his garden with dirt on his knees and sunlight on his face. Him sitting at a Thanksgiving table while everyone else talked around him. Look at his eyes, she said to me one evening, holding up a photo from 1994. He's not bored. He's carrying something. Yes, I said. He was. She hung that photograph in the hallway. It's still there. A month later, we held a second service. Not a military funeral. Grandpa wouldn't have wanted that. Not a ceremony, not a spectacle. Just a gathering at the small church in Lewisburg. This time, more people came than I expected. Mrs. Perkins brought her whole family. A group of veterans from the VA hospital in Knoxville drove down in a van. 3 elderly men I'd never seen before arrived separately, each wearing civilian clothes, each carrying themselves with a stillness that I'd come to recognize. Colonel Mercer came. He stood near the back, just like the unnamed man at the first funeral. My father stood up and spoke. His voice was unsteady, and he didn't try to hide it. I spent my life measuring people by what they showed me, he said. My father never showed me anything, so I assumed there was nothing to see. I was wrong, and I don't say that lightly, because being wrong about a stranger is forgivable. Being wrong about your own father is something you carry. My mother spoke next. She was brief. Henry Calloway never asked for attention. He never asked for recognition. He only asked for our time, and we didn't give it to him. I will live with that. Kyle didn't speak publicly. But after the service, he walked to the grave alone and placed a small model airplane beside the headstone. Grandpa had built model airplanes with him when he was a boy. It was the only hobby they'd ever shared, and Kyle had forgotten about it until he found a half-finished model in Grandpa's garage. I stood there last. I took the coin from my pocket and held it up in the light. The bronze caught the afternoon sun, and for a moment the interlocking lines on the back seemed to move, like a code rearranging itself. "You told me once that this was a reminder of people you couldn't talk about," I said quietly. "I understand now. You carried them all, every mission, every name, every life you saved and couldn't claim. And you did it without a single word of complaint." I placed the coin at the base of the headstone, next to Kyle's airplane and the flowers my mother had brought. "I'll keep being stubborn," I said. "Just like you." The wind moved through the cemetery. Duke, who Mrs. Perkins had been watching since the funeral, was lying in the grass nearby. He lifted his head, looked toward the headstone, and then settled back down. I'd like to think he understood. After the service, Colonel Mercer pulled me aside. "There's something else," he said. He handed me a thin envelope. "These arrived at the VA hospital over the years. Letters from men your grandfather served with. They were addressed to his unit designation, not his name. I've been holding them since the program was declassified." Inside were 6 letters, each from a different person. Some were short, some filled entire pages. All of them thanked a man they identified only by his call sign for saving their lives in places the American public was told U.S. forces never operated. One line from the last letter stayed with me. "You never left anyone behind. Not once. Not even when they ordered you to." I folded the letters carefully and placed them back in the envelope. "He never knew these existed?" I asked. "No," the colonel said. "The system doesn't deliver mail to ghosts. My family has changed. Not perfectly, not completely, but in ways that matter. My parents visit the Veterans Center in Lewisburg once a month now. They don't go to make themselves feel better. They go because Grandpa used to sit in the back of that room, and they want to understand why. My father stopped measuring people by their job titles. He told me recently that he'd started talking to the janitor at his office building, a quiet man from Guatemala who'd been working there for 11 years. Nobody knew his name, my father said. I had to ask 3 times before he believed I actually wanted to know. My mother donated to a fund that supports veterans with unrecognized service-related illnesses. She didn't tell anyone. She just did it, quietly, the way Grandpa would have. Kyle adopted Duke. He drives him to the cemetery every other Sunday. And I still carry the coin. Not in my pocket anymore, but on a chain around my neck, under my uniform, close to my chest, where it can't be seen. Because that's what Grandpa taught me. That the things worth carrying are often invisible. That the strongest people are frequently the quietest. That service doesn't require applause, and sacrifice doesn't require an audience. My family learned this too late for him, but not too late for the rest of us. So if you're listening to this and you know someone like my grandfather, someone who sits quietly at the edge of the room, someone who helps without being asked, someone who deflects every question about their past with a gentle smile and a change of subject, pay attention to them. Don't wait. Don't assume they're fine. Don't assume silence means there's nothing underneath. Because sometimes the people who carry the most are the ones who say the least. And by the time you realize what they were holding, they may already be gone. Thank you for listening. If this story reminded you of someone in your life, I hope you'll reach out to them. And if you'd like to hear more stories about the quiet people who shaped the world without asking for credit, you're always welcome here.